The Great Upheaval of 1946 and the American Dream. Chapter 3. The Great Upheaval of 1946. The labor tempest breaks labor, did their patriotic duty, and they would not be forgotten when the guns fell silent. By 1945, with Hitler defeated and Japan reduced to rubble, they were no longer content to wait. The American working class, having sacrificed in silence during the war, was ready to speak and strike. They experienced what can only be described as a moment of collective enlightenment. Like a man who suddenly realizes he's been paying for his own beating, they began to question the fundamental assumptions of their existence. And then, the seismic rattle. The result was the most magnificent display of organized rebellion in American history. Beginning in January 1946, the workers of America engaged in what can only be described as a nationwide strike of cosmic proportions. The first 6 months of 1946 was a period of the most concentrated period of labor management strife in the country's history, when virtually the nation's entire workforce finally rebelled against decades of brutality and injustice. American workers en masse and in totality, filled with rage and frustration at their system-induced misery, finally reached the point where they were defiantly unwilling to slave in dangerous and low-paid occupations, while the corporations and their elites celebrated unprecedented and stratospheric profits. From Asia and Europe, soldiers are coming home to a nation victorious, a world in ruins, and a promise of a better life. But here at home, the factories have grown quiet. The assembly lines have stopped, and the air is thick with tension. The great pressure cooker of wartime sacrifice is about to explode. This is the story of the Great Strike Wave, the year America almost came apart. January 1946. The first shot is fired not with a gun, but with a walkout. On January 15th, 200,000 electrical workers, members of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers, UE, switch off their machines and the entire American economy at General Electric, Westinghouse, and the electrical division of General Motors. They walk off the job nationwide. Plants shuttered from Pittsburgh to Peoria, leaving the nation's power grid in the hands of management, always a risky proposition. Demands, fair wages, safety, dignity, a 2-a-day wage increase, a share of the massive profits they helped create. The nation's power to build the appliances of the new peace is instantly crippled. Meatpackers strike. Just 1 day later, the crisis deepens. From Chicago to Omaha, from Kansas City to Sioux Falls, the great stockyards fall silent. 100,000 members of the United Packing House Workers of America, UPWA, walk out of slaughterhouses, citing inflation and poverty wages. The smell of revolution, not just meat, fills the air. The supply of meat to the nation's dinner tables grinds to a halt. The message is clear. If we cannot have a living wage, the nation will not eat. America would have to go vegetarian. But this is only the beginning. The true titan of American industry is steel, the backbone of the nation. On January 21, 1946, the United Steelworkers Union launches the largest strike in American history. 750,000 men bank their furnaces, abandon their forges, and walk out of the steel mills, and created what amounted to an industrial apocalypse. The industrial heart of America stops beating. From Pittsburgh to Gary, the skies, once choked with smoke, are eerily clear. From ominous gray to an even more ominous silence. 1 million workers now on strike. Spring and summer, 1946. The nation is reeling. But more is to come. 1 million strikers begat millions more. The coal miners, led by the magnificent John L. Lewis, the fiery and formidable leader of the United Mine Workers, a man who understood that the best way to get management's attention was to turn off the lights, threatened to plunge the nation into darkness. In April, Lewis and 400,000 coal miners leapt forth from their pits to remind everyone what a dark age is really like. A nationwide energy crisis loomed as lights begin to flicker in American cities. The breaking point comes in May. The railroad brotherhoods, representing the arteries of national commerce, announce a strike. It was a national earthquake. For a moment, it looked as if every American whose job involved dirt, danger, or anything louder than a typewriter was ready to trade their punch card for a picket sign. In the first half of 1946 alone, over 5 million workers went on strike, the largest wave of labor unrest in American history. The strikers weren't just blue-collar. They were later joined by teachers, transit workers, telephone operators, oil drillers, warehousemen, longshoremen, and newspaper printers. America itself ground to a halt. The beauty of this uprising was its sheer comprehensiveness. It wasn't merely a labor dispute, it was a full-scale revolt against the established order. By the first half of 1946, over 5 million workers were on strike, a number so large that it achieved the kind of statistical sublimity usually reserved for astronomical phenomena. And it was just beginning. The Great Upheaval of 1946 and the American Dream. Chapter 4. The Plutocratic Panic, Troops, Threats, and Truman's Fury. The reaction of the ruling classes to this unprecedented display of worker solidarity was a masterpiece of comic hysteria. President Harry Truman, that plain-spoken man of the people, responded with the kind of measured statesmanship one might expect from a Missouri haberdasher suddenly confronted with the collapse of civilization. Truman, raised on a diet of metaphors and militarism rather than labor disputes, fumed. What's a president to do, as he wrings his hands? Fearing a total paralysis that would starve the nation and halt all economic activity, he goes on the radio with a blistering address. He condemns the union leaders and threatens to use the ultimate power of the state. He composes a speech to Congress asking for the authority to draft the striking railroad workers directly into the United States Army, a proposal so magnificently authoritarian that it would have made Mao Zedong smile. In an early draft, his fury is palpable. He writes by hand that he wants the authority to hang a few traitors and make our country safe for democracy, a sentiment that perfectly captured the democratic spirit of the age and emblematic of the elite's fear. Democracy being best protected by a touch of the gallows. Wall Street, meanwhile, was seized by the kind of panic usually reserved for the appearance of 4 horsemen in the sky. The editorial pages warned of Bolshevism and mob rule, as if the average union man was a Parisian with a guillotine in his lunchbox, and apparently unaware that the mob in question was composed of the same patriotic Americans who had recently saved the world from fascism. The cosmic joke was that these titans of industry, these masters of the universe, had created a situation where their own survival depended on the goodwill of the very people they had spent decades oppressing. It was as if a man who had been kicking his dog for years suddenly discovered that the dog had grown to the size of a rhinoceros. The nation held its breath. Has it come to this? Federal troops seizing industries, soldiers forcing men to work at bayonet point? The air crackles with the possibility of open, violent conflict, not between nations, but between the American government and its own working people. Chapter V. The Great Capitulation and Calculation. Why the elites backed down, and they were forced to blink. The resolution of the crisis came with the kind of sudden clarity that usually accompanies religious conversion or nervous breakdown. The elites realized, with the startling lucidness of a man who has just stepped off a cliff, that they had 3 choices: grant the workers' demands, face a revolution that would make the French Terror look like a church picnic, or watch their newly created global economic empire crumble while they argued about principles. The choice, when presented in such stark terms, was remarkably easy. The same industrialists who had spent decades explaining why decent wages would destroy civilization suddenly discovered that paying living wages was not merely possible, but profitable. The strikes were settled just minutes before Truman delivered his incendiary speech to Congress. But the elite's capitulation was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a cold, hard calculation based on three overwhelming realities. 1. Fear of a second American Revolution. The sheer scale of the unrest was unprecedented and revolutionary. At its peak, over 5 million workers were on strike in 1946. This was not a collection of isolated disputes. It was a unified, nationwide, cross-industry mass movement. It wasn't just a labor action. It was a labor uprising. It shook the confidence of industrial barons and Washington elites. They feared a Paris Commune, an American Petrograd. In boardrooms and behind Capitol doors, the whisper was the same. If we don't give them something, we may lose everything. Pickets from different unions supported each other. The country was becoming ungovernable. For the ruling class, the choice was becoming stark. Either make concessions or risk a full-blown social revolution that could upend the entire capitalist system. The memory of revolutionary waves in Europe was fresh, and the fear that it could happen here was very real. 2. Unparalleled economic opportunity. The second reason was greed. The United States stood alone as the only major industrial power not ravaged by World War II. America had emerged from World War II untouched, while Europe and Asia lay in ruins, cities, factories, and farms destroyed. The U.S. had a near monopoly on industrial output. This created an almost limitless international market for American goods. Every car, every refrigerator, every ton of steel the U.S. could produce had a guaranteed buyer. A prolonged industrial shutdown was not just a domestic problem, it meant losing out on the greatest economic opportunity in world history. Business leaders realized they needed a stable, productive workforce to feed the global market. It was ultimately more profitable for corporations to grant higher wages and benefits than to lose months or years of production fighting the unions. Suddenly, labor peace became a capitalist imperative. 3. An outright civil war. The returning soldiers and officers who had fought fascism abroad were not about to accept feudalism at home. A reckoning force once they sided with their working-class brothers. These battle-hardened veterans utilized modern weapons and tactics with considerable efficiency, provided additional motivation for this sudden conversion to industrial democracy. A civil war against men who fought the Wehrmacht and stormed fortified Pacific islands focused even the most obtuse corporate mind. The ruling classes, faced with the prospects of revolution, lost profits, and a civil war from veteran troops, chose to make a deal. They experienced what can only be described as a moment of enlightenment. Liberal New Dealers pushed for a reconciliation between labor and capital, one that birthed the post-war social contract.